talked about those principles. I hadn't heard about them before. So
Sure.
Why don't we go there? It sounds intriguing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, the most common thing I see, athletes walk through the door and they've heard about me or seen some content and they come in and they want jump training. They want to jump higher. And I think every athlete, no matter what sport you're in, I think that becomes such a hot topic, right? Because it's in my opinion, one of the, if not the most true expression of overall athleticism is how do I get a human body off of the earth as high as possible, as many times as possible in any given period of time. So for me, it was vertical jumping has been looked at for so long as, okay, how do I apply as much force as possible to the ground? Then how do I spend as little time on the ground as possible? And how do I mitigate some of the effects of how much I weigh and my composition? And for so long, it's been looked at like vertical jumping, as long as you have those 3 points covered, all good. You're going to jump higher, and you absolutely will. I don't want anybody to think that out of the gate that won't work. It absolutely will. But I believe, and this is my school of thought, and this is, I think, what separates me a little bit, is that we put so much stock into so many elements of fitness and sport in terms of practicing a skill. Okay, so I'm going to correlate this a little bit over to the world of weightlifting. And weightlifting has become a little bit more prevalent with the world of CrossFit and things like that. But weightlifting forever and for history has been a hugely power-influenced sport that requires an immense amount of control through a variety of positions, whether you are clean and jerking, whether you are snatching. What becomes extremely important is, how do I continue to apply force, but then have positional stability throughout the entire chain of movement? So I said, okay, we do this with weightlifting, and people put so much focus into understanding principles of technique as it applied to a clean and jerk and to a snatch. But why is it that jumping is only seen as just push as hard as you can and then jump, and that's just the result, right? So I've always been a little bit of a technician when it comes to my own training and watching other athletes. And I think in the early years, people were a little bit, they didn't know what to think. And I would get an athlete and I say, okay, stop for a second. Let's go back, do it again. Stop for a second. Let's go back, do it again. And I would sit there and I would ponder, and I would have this old video on old little flip camera things that looked like I was filming it off of a potato. It looked, you couldn't see it. But what I would do is I would sit there and study as much film as possible and see commonalities in position, in reference to a lot of work that had already been done. But there wasn't a lot done in terms of mechanics appropriate to creating a higher ceiling for specifically 2-foot leapers. And volleyball is a unique setting in that it's a repeatable jump in a lot of instances, right? We have a very similar approach no matter where you are on the court, pending some shifting scenario within a game. So I said, okay, I need to come up with some fundamental principles that will only ever, and this is something to note here, these principles will only ever vary by need and never by kind. And what that means to me is the principles remain the same, but the application of them becomes different depending on the sport or the scenario you're applying them to. So first principle of the PPA principles of jump technique is landing mechanics. And I talked a little bit about having to reverse engineer this and make it in a way that is a little bit more palatable. So we talk a little bit about practice like anything else. With landing, it's practice. Perfect practice yields favorable landings. And how does that look? Well, a landing really, when it's done to its primary function, is a squat pattern. It is absorbing impact through large mechanics, which is our hips, and then also integrating some breathing and bracing techniques to help create additional what's called intra-abdominal stability. And I'm sure you're very aware of that, as your coaches are as well. But understanding that sometimes, without even knowing it, our breathing mechanics can influence, first of all, takeoff height, and then also landing efficiency over time. Okay, so landing, I'm going to do a little bit of a brief synopsis because I could talk about this. We'd be here for 2 days and we'd have to cut the live feed eventually. But first and foremost being landing mechanics. It is important to understand that the more you practice this, so this means that no matter, and quick tangent is when I train my athletes is obviously we go through the strength conditioning components similar to that of which Mettle would provide. But what I do is I like to work technique into a lot of these workouts in different physiological states, because we're not always jumping fresh. Most importantly, we're likely mostly jumping out of breath or a little bit fatigued. So that athlete needs to learn how to understand how to stabilize their body in these different physiological states. So we constantly, and I drill this and I say, We need to land with perfect mechanics. And then the common response is, you can't do that in a game, right? And I'm sure you've seen that, is it's very difficult to hit these perfect landing sequences in a game. The point being is that if we practice landing mechanics more frequently, then the likelihood our body deviates and actually creates this landing as its more neutral position, meaning that it's going to recognize this as being biomechanically relevant because it's been done so many times that it will default to that more often. And that's the goal, is not land perfectly every time, is can we default to a point of landing that is more advantageous for our joints and our body over our course of our career.
Yeah, agreed. I think Stu McGill, and I'm sure many others, refer to that as kind of an engram in your mind, right? So you create this, it's the neuroplasticity kind of piece where every time you do something poorly, it kind of corrupts that engram. So the more often you can do it perfectly, the more likely, as you said, your body is to try to find that position as often as possible. So I think
absolutely.
Yeah, that's great.
So then we take another step back, and following a landing, obviously we have to take off first before we land. So there's a lot of things that happen on takeoff. And more importantly, there's a lot of things that lead us to that position at takeoff that can really influence the effectiveness of that takeoff. So I speak a little bit about the concept of ground contact time and then reactive strength indexes, things like that I'm sure you're familiar with. To give kind of a general synopsis is, how do we get the athlete to apply as much force in as little time as possible to optimize not only the power at takeoff, but also the horizontal speed created through their approach? Okay. That then works itself into a little bit of the takeoff angle requirements for any given jump. So when I do an analysis on an athlete, what I'm looking at is, are they optimizing what's called their maximum controlled velocity? This really just refers to the balance at which an athlete can approach with speed, whereby that speed then becomes too much where their body can't stabilize, and vice versa, is, are they not optimizing the amount of speed they can carry relative to their stabilization potential at that point? So then what I'll have athletes do is basically just vary the speed at which they approach, and then it becomes a lot of eye and rhythm training. So this is the one thing that is difficult to explain, is that I view jumping very differently from the average person and coach, is that because I've not only been involved in this my entire life as a coach, is that, or not my entire life, but the vast majority of my adult life as a coach, but I competed as an athlete for many, many years. So I was a track and field athlete for years in the multi-event scene. So pentathlete for the University of Windsor, competed for Team Ontario. I had a chance to play around with some national competitions. And then I got into the world of professional dunking. So I actually traveled the world as a 6-foot guy who jumped very high as a result of training. And I think that it was a lot of trial and error over time. And then it was like, how do I put this all on paper to find out how exactly I did this? Because when I entered the world of professional dunking, I had a decent vertical jump of around 38 or 39 inches for my approach, which is, in the world of jumping is fairly impressive. Flirting with that 40-inch barrier is when you're starting to kind of separate yourself from other athletes. So it was, how do I optimize that? I trained for a good year and a half, 2 years, implementing different strategies of training, And what I found was, within about a year, I managed to increase my vertical jump to near 50 inches. And I didn't really know what I had at that point. I remember walking out on the court at the University of Windsor, and the men's basketball team was finishing their practice, and they were dunking some basketballs. And I had a fascination with dunking, and I wasn't very good at it, but I called for the ball, and they kind of looked at me and gave me weird eyes. And I said, let me just try. So I throw a lob, which is a bounce, and you try to catch this ball off a lob. I missed the ball completely. Okay, I jumped, missed the ball. But what happened was I hit my head on the rim, like really hard. And I came down, I was holding my head. And at that point, like about 5 guys just left the gym in a full sprint screaming. And I had really no idea what I had done because I wasn't familiar. And they said, you just hit your head on the rim. And I didn't really, realize how impressive that was at that time. And what I did over the next course of my career was just note take changes to my program, whether that was technical or training related, and then really just try to formulate my own philosophy of jump training as it relates to sport. So that was a bit of a tangent. That being said,
it's a cool story. I mean, some people probably would never even know that professional dunking was a thing, right?
Especially from the world of volleyball. You know, it's big. It has a big following, and it really has in the past 5 years taken off, and it's become a sport of its own. And they've been talking about it actually becoming at one point an Olympic sport, very similar to that, say, of figure skating, where it's given scores based on relative difficulty and all these different factors. So it has made waves, and people have really pioneered that over time. And I was one of the early oncomers to that sport. So I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to travel a lot and meet a lot of probably the most impressive athletes that I've ever imagined seeing. So seeing them move and then talking with various coaches all over the world has really just reaffirmed my love for jumping. And it's when people ask me, what do you do as a career? I say, well, I help people jump. And they say, you can't make a career out of that. And I said, I made it a job to make a career out of it. So I'm very pleased at where that's went. So we talk the takeoff, and then we get into concept of optimizing arm swing through takeoff and the body's stretch reflex as it relates to the overall body. So basically stretch reflex referring to the response of muscular contraction that the body has, which is if we violently lengthen a muscle, the body's natural reaction is to shorten that to preserve the health of the muscle. So we learn how to optimize that through a variety of training, and I'm sure you guys do a lot of this training as well. But more importantly is, how does that look under the watchful eye of the technique for jumping? Arm swing, one of the biggest things with volleyball is, especially in the female side of things, because they tend to not be as naturally powerful, as we get this big lopey arm swing. We get really full range through anterior, posterior planes of this arm swing. And I think that there's not enough stock put into the effectiveness of maximizing that stretch reflex through that shoulder girdle, upper back, and then down into where that inserts into the abdomen. So we work a little bit on that arm swing mechanics as well as implementing a little bit more power and speed and control through that arm swing. And sometimes that means shortening the arm swing a great deal from the front. So we're not creating this huge counter movement. We're just doing a bit of a shorter counter movement to speed up the basically the amortization of that movement through takeoff. So then we get into, I guess, the amortization element, which is basically how do we convert that horizontal speed through takeoff? We amortize it, we load the body with additional potential energy created on takeoff. And we're always really looking for ways, I think, within training, without even really realizing it, of optimizing that amortization of an athlete. For me, what I found to be most successful, and I think if you guys can take anything away from this broadcast here in terms of jumping, is when I get asked, and I get it asked multiple times a day, is how do I jump higher? And it's such a painful question to see over and over again, because people are expecting jump squats or some crazy ballistic power movement that is going to give them crazy results. The quickest result I see is from implementation of just more dynamic stability through the joint. So the ability to translate power you already have, right, and you're unaware of that you actually have this. And that is why I've become a little bit more known for being able to take an athlete and increase their vertical jump within 5 or 10 minutes. And that is just using what they have more efficiently. Right. So we can sit there and try to pound athletes through a whole bunch of training and say, yeah, in 6 months from now, you definitely will jump higher. They will. But in the short term, showing them, and I think that's the aha moment they have, like, wow, technique is actually incredibly important, that I can go, okay, you've touched 10'5" off an approach. Let's back up. Let's take a look and break this down through video. Here are 2 points I want you to work at. All I want you to work on is, let's say, for instance, accelerating a little bit faster through your last 2 strides. So I want you to push into that last stride as opposed to slowing in. So that tells me their run up is effectively null. It doesn't do anything for them. So let's shorten your approach. Let's just accelerate through this takeoff. And all of a sudden they go, wow, holy crap, I'm a lot higher. And what we've done is we've taken away in their mind this massive approach that to them seems like the further I run, the higher I jump. And then we know that it doesn't really correlate that way.
Yeah.
I give an analogy to many of my athletes and the people I work with of a garden hose. And this is, I think, the most usable analogy for younger athletes. Is everybody knows what a garden hose is and what it does, right? We plug it into a water source inside of our home and we wait to see the water come out the other end of the hose. And that pressure of that water will be directly related to, one, the flow coming in through the nozzle to start, and then also two, how stable that hose is from start to finish, meaning that there's no leaks, there's no holes, there's nothing in the hose. We have a steady stream of water. That pressure will be affected by leaks or holes in the hose. I equate that to an athlete. Your jump is effectively the joints in your body, the positions on your body that are leaking power or bleeding power are unstable, and that'll be the holes in the garden hose. So let's plug up as many of these holes as possible to increase efficacy of the actual jump from start to finish. And that garden hose analogy, and I refer to it a lot with my athletes through their training, is got to plug the holes. Just got to plug those holes. We got to plug one hole at a time, and eventually, overall, we improve our vertical jump.
I love that, because it's exactly ties right into kind of the assessment process we talked about earlier, which is like, let's identify limitations in either mobility, stability, or flexibility, or even generally muscle activity. So let's find those things and correct them.
Absolutely.
Because of course, if you've got limited ankle mobility, you're not going to have the full benefit of that lever, right, to kick off your jump if you have limited bad stability in your knees, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's exactly, those are the leaks that we both, it sounds like, really try to assess right off the bat, and then translate that into, of course, an efficient and effective jump.
We say that speed and power is great, but speed and power is only as useful as our ability to express or control it. And that's where I run into that kind of barrier. Is I get these athletes in that are just, they're so used to, it's just, we'll dump as much power and strength onto an athlete as possible. But that athlete, first of all, might not respond to that type of training very well. Secondly, they might really just be having trouble converting current power they have. And we can optimize that a lot just through creating new shapes and positions and then reaffirming those over time.
Yeah, it's like putting a 1,000 horsepower engine in a car that wasn't made for it, right? It's just going to
snap it in half
all over the road and destroy it, right? So,
exactly.
100%.
Then we get into, so this is the term that is got a lot more buzz through my social media platforms, is the penultimate step. And I'm sure you've heard of this term before, but penultimate simply means second last. In any application of jumping, there is a penultimate stride. In a 1 foot jump and a 2 foot jump, the responsibility is that this stride helps to, first and foremost, slightly lower the hips. And secondly is establish that takeoff position and help carry the speed attained through the approach to the point of takeoff. So the penultimate becomes an extremely important focal point to pattern efficiently and be in the right position so that we can optimize that speed and spend as little time on the ground as possible. This is the re-education process, especially in the world of volleyball, that I've had to start to take little bites out of. Is, I think the old adage was, and we talked about this, get as low as you can to get as high as you can, right? Get low to get high. And to a degree, for certain types of athletes, that's going to work to a point. But what happens there is, the lower we get, meaning the more time we spend in a squatting position, hinged position, the more potential energy we're bleeding. So we lose power every split second we spend in these positions. So first of all, how can we optimize that stretch shortening cycle and reflex of the muscle? And two, how can we put ourselves into what's called, I refer to as a stacked takeoff position, to ensure that we leave the ground as quick as possible and don't travel too far horizontally, unless of course that is the goal, let's say from a spin serve or perhaps a back row hit, that we do want to cover some horizontal distance. So optimizing this penultimate step in volleyball, it becomes to what's called pushing through this stride versus galloping through the stride. And it's funny now, I think this is going to be a perfect video that I can link over to a lot of my followership, that I get these DMs all the time going, please tell me what that means, or what. And it's tough because you only have a little bit of a space to write that in. So is pushing through this stride really becomes the hardest part for an athlete to attain. So we use drills such as jab drills and two-step, or the final two strides of the approach, and we pattern that as we press that foot forward. So as that athlete drives to their second last step, so if we have a right left right approach or a left right left approach, it's going to be either the right left or the left right, the last two strides. It's going to be the first of those two that set us up. And it's important for an athlete to understand that being forward as you drive into that step, which is a very common practice of most athletes, which is what I call diving into an approach, puts you in a very hyperflex position. Okay, so we have torso that falls forward. And what we have here is we have a hip girdle that now is out of alignment. So we lose this what's quote unquote stacked takeoff position. If we know anything about like mechanical loading, referred a little bit to like building a home, right? We put a 2x4 on its end for a reason, that when you put a load on top of that, that 2x4 doesn't just snap at a weak point. So we got to think about our body very similar to that of, say, a 2x4. When we create our most powerful position, which is that takeoff position, if we're not stacked, relatively stacked, can't be perfectly stacked, but relatively stacked, then we're going to be bleeding power through these joints. So understanding that when we push into our penultimate stride, hanging back the shoulders over the hips a little bit more than diving is going to set us up to leave the ground quicker. So what we're doing is we're basically just mitigating the body's our need to what's called recover or unravel the torso, which it will do naturally. We're mitigating the effect or the time it takes to do this by doing it a little bit earlier in our penultimate, so that when we hit this stride, we're already creating power through that hip drive, but we're in a position where now we can leave the ground almost immediately. If that makes sense.
Oh yeah, 100%.
It's a lot to ingest for someone that maybe doesn't have a little bit of that anatomical understanding, but the principles I put together try to explain that very well.
Yeah, I think the timing is an interesting piece, because you know, when I watch a lot of high level volleyball athletes, you definitely see that dive that you talk about, and I think we as coaches and trainers don't spend enough time just kind of deconstructing every little part of that approach and hit to try to finely tune all the pieces involved, and so that's super cool. I like that.
Yeah. For so long, the dive was really used, I think it still is, it's used as a timing protocol for initiating your approach. So we have an athlete setting up, let's say, out of left side, and then we get the set, and we have this athlete falling forward to a point where they can then accelerate. The problem then becomes is, yes, of course, it's great for creating forward momentum, but we need to get yourself taller earlier in that approach. So using that fall to create speed, and then getting yourself a little bit more back over those hips, where then you can optimize the actual jump itself. So it's a good strategy in one side of it, and then at the other side, it's providing a little bit of issue on takeoff.
For sure. So it's just when to start pulling out of it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
I like that. Very
exactly.
Cool.
This is very derivative of track and field, and I have a lot of background in track and field, and it's the jumping. Long jump, triple jump, high jump, even hurdling to a point is largely based on our ability to optimize that mechanical loading. And especially with 1 foot takeoff, is because 1 foot takes such a brunt of impact that if you're not in these positions, that's where you run into athletes blowing out knees and hips and backs, is that they're overloading a chain of movement in a very poor position, and then that will result in those surrounding tissues to be dramatically overworked very ballistically, and then we have this kind of unraveling of function.
For sure. That's awesome.
So there's a fair more. Now we get into, so I talked a little bit about maximum control velocity before. That's where we get into now. So I'm going to kind of skim over that a little bit because we've touched on what that really means. The last couple points to make are, first and foremost, is eyeline, and talking a little bit about what the eyes do in relation to the body in any sport and application of movement, is that they really do set the tone for a jump. We understand that where we look is typically where the body's natural range of motion and trajectory is going to head. A really good explanation of this is be watching an athlete do a box jump. And typically you'll see, based on fear normally, is they'll stare directly at the point of landing. What this does is create, right off the get-go, an inability to create full hip extension through takeoff. And number two, limits the height in which they can travel. So what they do is they end up jumping to their landing versus jumping and landing as a result of gravity pulling them down. And I think that when we drill these box jumps over and over and over again with that in mind, if they're staring at the box, what we're doing is we're drilling an athlete to be very used to limiting the expressiveness of hip extension. And then two is limiting the Eyeline in terms of how that relates to a game. So they're used to looking down. They're more often than not, when they take off, might look at the net or down in front of them without even realizing they're doing it. It could be really quick, but that could be a huge impact on trajectory of takeoff and then also where they impact the ball. So Eyeline, again, massively important. And the last is, this is a practice that I think you can relate to as just a coach in general, is mindset. Mindset is so important. And this is one thing when an athlete walks through the door with me and they begin training, is the first thing we talk about, aside from their assessment protocol, is what I call the think to be mentality. Is, okay, guys, you're going to be jumping today. So it's very important that you start wrapping your mind around the concept of becoming more explosive and quicker. That if you're not tapped in neurologically and then psychologically to this moment, then we're not going to pull as much of you that we can through our jump. So we think powerful to be powerful. We think strong to be strong, fast to be fast, bouncy to be bouncy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that becomes such a powerful tool for these athletes. Is, can we empower them to believe they can jump higher when they might have been told before that they're not built for jumping. So being able to kind of milk that last little inch or two out of them can come down to just the cognitive application of mindset training. So I think that became very powerful for Project Pure Athlete and working with my athletes and the ones around globally as well, is just why aren't you jumping higher? Is it a physical limitation, or perhaps is this something that you've built up in your mind and that's stopping you from getting that last little bit over time? And I guess the last point I'm going to make is, jump training is really just intelligent strength and conditioning with a bias toward the principles that comprise jumping. And not to be looked at as doing on its own. Is that if you train for your sport, here are a few more variables to consider. Practice your positions and jump more often. And perfect practice yields more favorable positions. It's kind of, in a nutshell, the principles of jump technique as they apply specifically to that 2-foot takeoff. But again, very, very, very similar to 1-foot takeoff. And even on landing, you talked a little bit about athletes landing on one leg or the other. I think at times that's unavoidable based on just momentum. The same mechanics apply to 1-foot landing. Is we need to load the hip, not the knee, and understand where the torso is in relation to the hip. So if an athlete is landing on 1 foot, as long as they're not dramatically overloading that knee joint, and that's why it's very important to train unilaterally. And I'm very certain that you guys do a lot of that as well. And I buy into a lot of the practices of Mike Boyle, in the sense that I believe that unilateral training over a broad scope is much more important than biasing bilateral training on its own. Like there has to be so much focus there.
Well, I mean, we'll do both, but if you can, of course, from a spinal health perspective, and I know that's where Boyle takes, focuses, is why overload the spine if you don't have to, because in the game of volleyball specifically, as we all know, the spine is overloaded in every position, whether it's rotational, extension, flexion, and compression. So if we hit it in the gym and just continue to do that, that's going to be a problem. We do need to, of course, train the body to be able to stabilize in all positions with an external load, so that when they land on 2 feet, they're stable. So there will be some, but yeah, no, 100. We're all about minimizing damage, taking appropriate risks in training, which we don't say, hey, above all else, everything is super safe, so that there's really no results. We program to be to consider the health of the athlete number one, obviously. And push their limits as appropriate, and that's how you get the best results, for sure.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
it's like I have this tattooed on my leg. It's in Spanish, and that's a whole other story. But sometimes we must slow down in order to speed up, and that is really just the overarching principle to my life, I guess, more so than even just training. Is if our goal is, if we're in a race and there's a goal, there's two ways to approach it. One is we put our head down and sprint as fast as we can, and we hope that we end up at the finish line. Or two is every now and then we reorientate ourselves with where we're headed and gain some perspective on life. And I think that's what really will set apart those good from great athletes, is in combination with really good coaching, is are you do you have perspective on your life and on your goals?